Welcome everyone. Welcome back all the PERN members who I haven't seen in a long time, but also welcome the people who are live streaming with us today. I'll just say something very brief about the Platform Economies Research Group. So we're a working group, and we've developed into sort of organically into an international network. There's lots of good work on digital platforms out there, and our conversation today on the review article will really reflect on that. But our focus is very specific, and that's on the ways that data becomes a value form, right? Or how data is monetized, how it's the basis for new asset classes, multi-sided markets, or computational platforms for exchange. So please check out the website where there's a mission statement that kind of summarizes all that. But there's also information on our reading group and our members' publications. But this is the launch of our Salon series, and I really want to thank Andy Moon and Layla Lynn, who've done an enormous amount of work to organize this. And I'm really thrilled to have Jenna Burrell and Marion Fourcade join us today to talk about their review article. I want to mention before I pass things on to the group, we have a second salon on October 21st, which is a conversation with Kian Birch, who's here today, on his wide-ranging work on techno-scientific capitalism and rentiership. And then we have our third salon, which is on November 18th, and that's a conversation with James Meese and Angèle Christin on digital media platforms and value production. So for those joining on the live stream, that's more information on those next two, which we'll post about later. And I'm going to pass things on to Sarah Mavle, who's going to moderate our discussion today. Brief note on Sarah, she's I love her title, Assistant Professor of Global Digital Media at UMass Amherst. She's known mostly for her work on networked communication, but especially as it relates to the Global South. And she's done really interesting work on mobile phone data and more recently on technological transfer between China and Africa. So Sarah, I will let you take over.
All right, thanks, Janet. I will now introduce the two authors. For those of you who are not familiar with them, Jenna Burrell is Professor of Information at UC Berkeley, where she is the co-director of the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group. She's also the interim director of research at Data and Society. She has written a book on youth and in internet cafes in urban Ghana. This was in 2012. And as far as I can tell, she's working on a second book. You can clarify if this is wrong, Jenna. She wrote this lovely review piece with Professor Marion Fourcade, who is Professor of Sociology and Director of Social Science Matrix at UC Berkeley also. She's also an associate fellow, at the Max Planck-Sciences Po Center on Coping with Instability in Market Societies. Her first book, Economists and Societies, via Princeton Press, was in 2009. And she also has a second book, The Ordinal Society, which is under contract. Quick welcome to both of you. What we're going to do is I'll let you speak for a few minutes on the main points of the article, just for those joining us via live stream who have not read it. And then give us a few words on how you arrived at this theme and perhaps where it's headed for you. I think the discussion before this salon was, there was a lot of interest in where the research will go for both of you following this review essay. So going in the order of authorship, I'll say Jenna, I'll invite you to speak first, and then Marion will follow up.
Great, thanks, Sarah. You saved us the trouble of trying to juggle, like, who goes first? Okay, I'll go first. So I just want to give a little bit of kind of few meta level comments about the paper. And actually what I had lined up for notes are really about where I am hoping to take some of the themes from this paper, and Marion will talk about that as well. The original title that was given to us to work with was called the Algorithmic Society, and we swapped the words and ended up calling it the Society of Algorithms. It's a piece in the Annual Review of Sociology. And both Marion and I have PhDs in sociology, though I've been at the School of Information for the last 15 years. Technically, I'm trained as a sociologist. And so we were trying to demonstrate the relevance and significance of algorithmic systems to sociologists and to try and show the relevance of this new work, this new phenomena, these various new social phenomena in the world in the context of both classic concepts in sociology and then, current iterations of some of those themes and also new things. We went way over the word count limit. I didn't know you could do that, but I think Marion knew. So we just roared right through that word count limit. We went way over the number of things we could cite. And I am especially proud that we managed to cite from so many different disciplines. So there's a lot that's in sociology, but we have Chi papers in there for those of you in the kind of iSchool world, you know what that means. We've got work by, economists, by STS scholars in communications and media studies, trying to kind of organize that and make it legible, especially to sociologists, but of course, anyone who's sort of interested in this space. I'm going to just highlight two threads that pull through the entire piece. One is this idea of the coding elite, and I would love to talk more about that. It's sort of become an obsession for me, this idea of the coding elite and the way they are. The obsession is, do we have that right? Is that the right term for it? Is that the right understanding of what's going on? So I've definitely been obsessed with this idea and this process. I feel like I'm observing around how they're consolidating power. And there's kind of classic Marxist theory of around classes that you can look at in historical materialism, but there's also a sociology of professions that I think this relates to, which is very interesting. So kind of working between those two areas of sociology. The second theme, which I will just mention, and Marion may want to say more, comes down to the title. So we started with the Algorithmic Society. We swapped it. We call it the Society of Algorithms. And that's meant to kind of shift how we're thinking about this topic from an idea of the original idea is maybe how algorithms manage opportunities, how they allocate things. And we're going a little further to suggest that how people themselves are being constituted is algorithmic, how they relate to each other and how they think of themselves is being mediated by algorithms. And that's sort of a more profound kind of change that may be taking place. So the piece is published. So you can give us feedback. We can't do anything about this paper, but we can certainly think about some of the ideas in the paper that might be developed further. So I had a recent conversation with someone that made me think about the coding elite as possibly sort of a reactionary response to the racial and gender diversification of professions. So now that there's so many people with very heterogeneous experiences and views coming into the professions and into other fields, you have this reaction, which is, kind of going back to rational, predictive, objective decision-making, kind of pulling away that discretionary power in the hands of people across the professions. And I think I'm really kind of stunned to see how much of the proposal around algorithmic decision-making targets elites, lawyers, doctors, judges, and cast those groups, those professions as inadequate to the task of making really important decisions. Okay, what else do I want to say? A couple of other things I would love to tee up as possible topics of conversation. I'd like to think more about sort of the coding elite and their implicit worldview, and to think about how to write about it. I mean, I think there's sort of it's rationality. It's about the ability to predict things, that there's sort of this nascent sense that the world would be a better place if we have more control over it, especially if we have more expert kind of informed control over it. I don't know if that's quite the right way to think about it. It strikes me as what we're seeing. And then secondly, how do we formulate an argument in defense of humans? If the argument from the coding elite is that people are inadequate to the task of decision making because they're not objective enough, they can't process all the data, they're not able to kind of pinpoint with predictive accuracy what the right decision is, how do we argue against that? On what tests do machines fail? Especially if we're thinking about cognition, what are the forms of cognition that humans excel at? So that's just a few questions around the theme of the coding elite. And I'll let, there are other questions I could raise, but I'll let Marion take it from there.
Thanks, Jenna. It's hard for me to add very much, but I'll try. So, as Jenna said, this is an annual review piece, and so it is a very particular genre, which, is supposed to cover as much ground as possible in, still only 30 pages or so, even though we went over the word count. So what we set out to do was really to speak to sociologists, and we did it by, I think, trying to deploy the tools of social theories to the fullest extent possible in that, in that short space. And, what social theory is concerned about is essentially social order, social stratification, subjectivity, culture, however you want to call it. And so those are sort of the three big themes, I guess, that are in the paper. One is, I guess for us, the most basic level that we wanted to build our argument upon was this notion of a new class, this coding elite. And we wanted to suggest that, we have a sort of, in a very Marxist kind of line of analysis, that we have sort of new relations of production, if you will, and that these relations are organized, are structured around the proximity or the distance to computer code, and actually more specifically to ownership of computer code. And that defines fundamentally these two classes, the coding elite on the one hand and the Cybertaria on the other. And what that means is that if you start thinking about it, the sort of social structure that way, what it means is that typically, there's a tendency for everything in between to sort of shrink. And everything in between includes a lot of the professions, both the high-level professions, as Jenna was mentioning, the doctors, the lawyers, and so on, but also a lot of the sort of more middle-class professions, the nurses and so on, the legal assistants, so in, the lower level in these same broad domains. And so that brings us to the second question, which is the question of sort of algorithmic rationality, and what kind of rationality do algorithms represent relative to the rationality carried out by these traditional occupations. And so here you can think about algorithms not simply as a question, of ownership and sort of organization of a material economy, but really as a species of bureaucratization. And, as Jenna said, one of the reasons why algorithms are so compelling today is that they promise objectivity. That means, they promise to eliminate human arbitrariness. They promise universalism and inclusion, in fact, and they also promise efficient resource allocation. Now, what's quite remarkable is that that was exactly how the professions were originally thought about. I mean, if you think about sort of Max Weber's, description of the profession, at the beginning of the 20th century, it is very, the description of bureaucracy, it is very much structured around these questions. So we have a sort of fantastic inversion where the professional person who was actually supposed to be, even though they were not in practice, but they were supposed to be the guarantee of objectivity, and that was done through training, and they were supposed to treat everybody equally, and so on and so forth. Now they are being seen as, of course, the problem. And you have indeed this coding elite that is, representing and in a relentless manner, right, professionals as being biased, as, being, using too much discretionary power, in addition to like working 9 to 5 as opposed to, 24 hours and so on. So, and in fact, the best proof of this is that these biases find their way, which are essentially the history of data that we have, right? Because of that, they find their way into algorithms, right? Because of the training data set. So, the professions have essentially screwed up all of this data, that we are dealing with, whether it's in medicine or in the police and so on and so forth. So that's, there is this sort of inversion that has happened. And this is not something, there's a general crisis of expertise. I think it's not simply in these domains. It's also, it's happening everywhere. There's around sort of the hierarchy of knowledge and information and all of that. And algorithms are participating in that sort of general, transformation or flattening of the hierarchy of knowledge. Now, this has two consequences of note, I think. One is, on the one hand, it has created new inequalities, because, if you think about the ways in which, if people are being sort of scored and sorted, not simply on the traditional, processes in the labor market or in the education system, but, the credit system and, possibly some sort of fitness or, lots of other things, then, you have all new pathways to inequalities that sort of emerge out of that. And of course, if you have new inequalities, that means that there are new politics that should be associated with that. And new points of pressure in the political system. And so we can talk about sort of the new politics that emerges out of that, those algorithmic inequalities. And the other consequence of note is clearly is this question of the fetishism of data and the fetishism of measurement and how it impoverishes our sort of moral and political imagination. That this is not something new. There's been lots of people before who have sort of criticized quantification and measurement as, fundamentally problematic. Actually, none other than Friedrich Hayek wrote a big critique of that, which is sort of interesting. We can see, we can talk about why he wrote it, when, and who were his targets at the time. But I think it's an important critique. And then finally, yes, there is this inversion that Jenna was talking about in the paper from this algorithmic society to the society of algorithms. We wanted here to sort of say, well, what is it? If people, if these categories that are produced by algorithms are quite different from the way in which people, have traditionally understood themselves, well, what is happening then to subjectivity? What is happening to the way in which we look at ourselves and we look at each other? And we point out that there's a number of consequences. There's a sort of disposition towards, searching for the truth about oneself, searching for the truth about the world. There's an externalization of all kinds of choices that is happening. So, all of these are making us turn into, partially constituted ourselves through algorithms. So, I'm just repeating what Jenna said in a different way, but this is essentially where the paper was ending. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you both for that really excellent overview. I think at this point, I could launch into a series of questions because you raised a number of them, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So I will ask everyone who is here to just simply start with the hand raise function if you want to jump in at some point, just so I can cue people in. But I will begin with just one maybe lowball question that I think came up in conversations before. The article does specify a number of what we might call value creation practices, right? Within this broad landscape that you paint for us. And it is really broad, right? And as Jenna mentioned, I know that you draw from various places. And the question that I have there is, would bringing specificity to the various practices, right, that revenue production, market capitalizations, those various processes that you mentioned, will that bring some specificity to the classes, or would that even change the classes that you came up with, right? You did mention, Marion, that in making these decisions on what to present, you did end up flattening some categories in between, right? So you have a cybertariat, and then you have an elite. One would argue that there is a wider range here. So perhaps going through the various practices that you mentioned, would that give you that flexibility, or is it even necessary to do that? So we can begin with that, and then I think others might want to join in at some point. And feel free to go in whatever order, Jenna and Marion. There's no fix here.
Jenna, you want to go, or I can? All right. Okay, I can go. Very good question. Thank you very much. I think really the political economy aspect, it's true that it is a little underdeveloped in the paper. And, but I think fundamentally, this notion of the coding elite, the way that we could characterize this sort of new form of economic power has to do very much with the ability to scale, right? Has to do with this ability to sort of enormously multiply, the extent of the market, or the audience, or whatever it is that you want to reach. So which means that there's a form of monopolistic power that is sort of built into, the technology itself, which I think is really, really, really important. And so we don't sort of say that too much in the paper, but I think it's very much part of this economic power of the coding elite. In addition to the cultural powers that we talk about, there's also this legal power of sort of making the rules, because computer, makes certain kinds of rules that are, end up being really important in structuring the legal, sort of the legal environment. In terms of whether we should think about the coding elite as, and the cybertariat, as most disaggregated, of course we should. If you think about, think about Marx, and not to say that, not to be modest or anything, but think about the way that, he writes. Of course, when he writes the Communist Manifesto, there's sort of two big classes, right? But then when he writes about the, what's going on in the 19th century, of course, what he's seeing is that there are all of these fractions of classes. It's a very complex world. And so, but there is, we think that there is a sort of advantage to using a certain kind of word, right, to represent that fundamental distinction between those who are, close, and especially those who own computer codes, versus those who don't, and who are in fact owned by it because their own work is owned by it. And I think that's the basic distinction that we wanted to make. But of course, in practice, for whoever student, scholar, who is writing about this, you have to be sensitive to the real, what does it mean to own computer code? Well, you might have some entrepreneurs, you might have some VCs, you might have some Wall Street firm, you might have some pension fund, so it becomes extraordinarily complex. And but that story, is a lot harder to tell, and takes a lot more space.
Mm-hmm. Jenna, do you want to add to that before I see Janet's hand up?
I think that was a really good answer to the question. I think as I was listening to Marion talk, what I thought might be worth adding is that I always think about things through the frame of theories of materiality, usually not Marxist, not usually historical materialism, but there's kind of materialism all over this, in both senses, in all senses. So So there's the materialism of the technology itself and its ability to scale, right? And its ability, like for the code to be able to kind of infinitely be reproduced. That's super important, that I think is really new and significant. And there's also the financial materialism. So it's not just that the code, when you write it, it scales. It's that the VC firms are kind of selecting out winners and losers based on what they think will scale. And we could go into much more detail than we do about how tech is funded. I'm living through it right now because my spouse has a startup. So I'm like, wow, it's like, unless there's like an obvious way that this will require no labor in order to go global, you can't get significant VC funding. And that rules out a lot of things you might do with code. So it's very like it reinforces itself from both the funding side and from the like code writing side.
Yeah. And scale itself is in some ways, in this particular sense, sort of subjective. Certain projects scale, others don't. It depends on what part of the world you're looking at and what you're talking about. So there's something about the specificity of Silicon Valley logics at play here that when we consider, and a number of us in this group work across the globe, right? And once we start thinking of these categories and we think of the logics that you brought up, some of it breaks down in other regions, right? And so I think some of the discussion, between us has been about the specificity of Silicon Valley logics, and the way that scale is selectively used, right?
I'll add one comment to that, which is like, by scale, do we mean it works at scale? Like, what do we mean by scale? So do we mean, when we say it scales, does that mean we say it works? Because I think that's what you're pointing to, is like, it doesn't work, right? Or there's a lot of work to make it appear to work in other geographies. Yeah, great.
Janet's hand was up first, and then Keen. So Janet, you may.
Yeah, sure. So thank you both. Like, one of the things, I mean, you've done so much work here, drawing on, I mean, I'm repeating what's already been said, but drawing on so much literature. So there's always that kind of response you get when you write something like this, which is like, oh, those categories, or can be broken down. And like, of course they can, right? So, but since you raised the question in your short presentation about kind of the sociology of professions, that's really interesting to me, or I would say even of experts or certain forms of knowledge, right? And this idea of the coding elite, I mean, there's the obvious question that gets raised about the danger of kind of homogenizing or making this monolithic block. And so without like giving that sort of obvious critique, I'm wondering though, I get a little wary about the idea of like an algorithmic logic, but this is the anthropologist in me, because I'm wondering if the constituents of this coding elite, so even if I don't get stuck on like, oh, it's monolithic, okay, let's just forget that question, right? But if I looked at the constituents, the question would be like, are they performing the same forms of rationality? Like, I think that's an open question. And if yes, like, what are those forms? I would make it into like a process question. Like, what are the forms of rationalization that are like operationalized and integrated into our systems and our practices, right? Like a socio-technical kind of rationalization. And there can't be one form. I mean, or we would all, the whole world would look the same. So I guess that's like a way I would think that, and this, to be honest, like, as you said, I'm not asking you to do in your text what you didn't set out to do. So not saying, why didn't you do that? I'm just wondering, like, going forward, would that be a kind of question that you would look at in your own individual research projects or something like that? I hope that makes sense. And then secondly, I won't hesitate on this because I'm curious to hear what Kian's going to say. but I think there is I always ask this question because I'm obsessed, but like, this is a really good account of like this sociological production of class relations, right? And so you encapsulate in this review, this approach to algorithms as this new means of production. And I guess because of our group, our 4 years of conversations about value production has really made me very focused on this distinction, which Kian writes about, between revenue production on the one hand and market capitalization on the other, which is like so fundamental to, most of the production, if you want to call it that you're looking at. Because accumulation derives from these two related, they're separate, revenue on the one hand and market capitalization on the other. They're separate, but they're, but related. And I guess if we start, I could say more, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. But I think if we start picking that apart, the owners of the means of production becomes less clear. Like who owns algorithms, who owns code, how this gets structured, how it gets financialized or capitalized, like all of this becomes less, the question of the owners of the means of production becomes really complex. But those are two separate comments I'm making. Maybe Kian can speak and I'll figure out how to put my hand down in the meantime. So thanks.
You can join, you can follow up with the question if it's related, or we can give Marion and Jenna some time to respond, and then you can jump back in.
Sorry, my computer just froze. Was that a question to me, or was that?
Yes, I was saying if your question is related to Janet's questions or her comment, then we can kind of bundle, but we can also just give Marion and Jenna a minute to respond.
Kind of related to all the previous questions, I guess. It's just, I suppose, a sort of follow up the questions already. So I'm happy to wait if you want, or.
Yeah, let's give Marion and Jenna a chance to respond, and then you can come back in.
I kind of wanted to pick up on that first part of the question from Janet about constituents, and you asked if they're performing the same forms of rationality. Are you thinking of within the group of people we might call programmers, that there are different people in that group, different people doing different kinds of programming? Or are you thinking like the kind of categories? There's the program, we put a bunch of people in there. The programmers, people actually writing code, the VC funders, the CEOs of tech companies, the like professors, CS professors. I think this is something that I observe firsthand, or that we both observe firsthand. Like the CS professors they go on leave, they start a startup, they bring in millions of dollars in consulting. So there's like kind of an ecosystem or a web of relationships that we've all kind of put all those people together and called them the coding elite. So that's the first clarification question. You're talking about categories of roles, or are you talking about within a category, the heterogeneity?
No, I'm talking about when you say coding elite, all of those positions that you just described. Actually, I would love to see a whole article just on the CS professors, to be honest. Like, it seems to me they're not all performing the same forms of rationality, right?
Yeah, I would love to think more about it, because to me it seems pretty undistinguished. It feels like kind of a one-note conversation that I either observe or I hear from people a lot about, just absolutely this kind of faith in optimization or predictive accuracy, and that kind of objectivity that goes with that, that's proven in the world when you make a model and you predict something and it comes true. It seems kind of wall to wall to me. Well, wall to wall. I guess though, if you think of, because I kind of want to put the behavioral economists in there too, and the ones who kind of do these studies and find that humans are so irrational, and because that gets drawn from by programmers building these models of machine learning, which do a better job of making more rational decisions. So I guess there's flavors there. To me, it seems like a philosophy of what will make the world a better place. That's very one note. But sometimes it's targeted at better distributing resources. Sometimes it's targeted at automating things humans do imperfectly and irrationally. Sometimes it's, meant to detect and kind of overcome human misbehavior, like fraudulent activities. So I guess that is, as I'm talking through it, it does seem like we're talking about different targets at which a kind of rationalist worldview are directed, and to make slightly different arguments about why this is the way to kind of move forward and to make improvements in the world.
Yeah, so just to jump in though, that's extremely helpful. Like the optimization as a form of rationality helps me a lot. I guess I'm wondering if like a VC, a VC kind of strategy around this is a lot about APIs and creating asset classes that can then be used on, financial markets for other things, which is different from the question of optimization, right? I perfectly see what you're saying. That was extremely helpful, but I guess I'm thinking in a broader
well,
sense.
if we're bringing in, VCs and VC firms, I'm like, are they thinking at one point in time, I think they definitely kind of bought into a vision of like making the world better through systems. But at the end of the day, I think they're thinking, what will make us the most money?
Yeah.
And that's what they're optimizing.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There's the optimization logic again, but it's like really focused on money they put in relation to money they think they will get back.
Kian,
Not
do you
to
want to
oversimplify it, but it just kind of simplifies things a lot. Yeah.
So maybe I'll take the second question around sort of, what is this logic of accumulation that we have here? Yes, and I agree with you. There is this fundamental difference, of course, between sort of a firm's, what economists typically call fundamental value, right? And the market value, which is essentially a function of the sort of the desire that it inspires for people in the markets, to own the stock, and what's the fundamental value depends on sort of the fundamentals like revenue and stuff like that. And that's, but that's not specific, of course, to digital capitalism at all. It's, it's every firm and every, all of capitalism, all of financial capitalism is organized around this fundamental distinction. But so from that point of view, you can think about sort of data as, a form of asset. Kian's work is, of course, essential here, but it can be two or three different things as an asset. So one thing is it can be, a sort of a stock of assets, if you will, that a firm uses to sell services. This is sort of Facebook using its own data to market. It can be something that can actually be sold. So, if the firm fails, or if it's bought by something else, this big databases can be sold at a certain price, right? And then it can sort of, then you can have all kinds of products, of course, that can be made on the basis of that. And, the financial economy then takes over, and you can have, you can think about, derivatives and all kinds of things that can be made out of this. So there, so I agree with all of that. My own sort of approach to the logic of accumulation is a little bit different. And I think there's something that is really quite unique, something that is really unique to digital capitalism is the way in which it begins. That is, it often begins by enrolling people for free. That is, to me, the most fundamental fact about digital capitalism. It is that it comes into our lives, as something that looks like a present. It comes from the sky. It's like you can just log in, or send your email address, and boom, you have access to a whole new world, whether it's a social media platform or it's an email service or it's a cloud storage service, and you have all of this stuff, right? And that, is happening, of course, because in the background, there is this implicit, which is made explicit through, a very simple form that we all sign without thinking about it twice, right? This implicit consent. But there's this fundamental notion of sort of a free gift, and that logic of accumulation, that's partly why it scales so well, precisely because it comes that way, right? Because so many of these services, it feels like it's sort of irresistible. And not only that, if you want to just be part of society, you have to be part of that stuff, right? So there's a why not moment, since you don't have to pay for it. But there's also, of course, as soon as everybody's there, there's like a why not, which is more sort of the coercion of the social norm. And I think, to me, that's a really important aspect of that sort of logic of accumulation. That's how, of course, the value and the assets, all the stuff that Keane and others talk about, right? This is where very much, this is where they come from. So thinking about not simply the accumulation logic and how it reproduces itself, which I think is really important, but so thinking the process of the primitive accumulation, what Marx would call the primitive accumulation. How do you jumpstart the whole thing? So I don't know if I made myself clear, but I think this is something that is quite unique in the history of capitalism, actually. I mean, there are examples of stuff that comes for free, but not that much.
Yeah, I would say I believe Tiziana Terranova and sort of Christian Fuchs and a few of the autonomous Marxists have written extensively about this particular logic of free labor and describing it as immaterial labor and as a basis for this particular digital economy. Go ahead, Marion.
Yeah, that's not simply free labor. It's not simply that we provide labor for free to the platform. Mm-hmm. It is that the products of the platform are offered to us for free. That's to me, that's also very important, right? For free, and then, later, sometimes, you move from like a free to a freemium model of, you have these different ways of, but, every entrepreneur, and this is something that, came out of some of the fieldwork that I was doing here in the Valley, is that, every entrepreneur, one after another, would describe the service as, oh, we offer this for free. And in exchange, there's this sort of, you just have to give us access to your email inbox or something like that. You just click a button and this happens. But that to me is something that is really important to understand the process of sort of value creation.
Right. The free offer brings
the free offer.
Brings in free,
the free labor is
free labor.
Too. Absolutely, and
which is then monetized in a way, right? And becomes private property after. And that there's a key distinction there, right? You offer a free product, you get free labor that generates the data that then becomes the private property of the person.
But it's that free offer, that moment. And there's a long, of course, there's a long history of cultivating that culture. Cultivating that spirit, in Silicon Valley, going back to the 60s, of course, of, sharing code, the notion of sharing, the very idea, the very term sharing is quite extraordinary when you think about it.
Kim?
Thanks a lot. I apologize, my internet's a little bit funky tonight. So if I freeze, I apologize. Yeah, very stimulating paper, really enjoyed reading it, and discussion is really, is really fascinating right now. I was going to follow up with one thing, and now I want to follow up with another thing, and so I'm kind of torn. I'll maybe follow up just with what the last thing Marion was talking about. So I think what she was identifying around the ability to, say the data companies, the ability to. It's really perhaps part of the explanation around the kind of market capitalization, because it is a reflection of the the kind of growth and expectations around growth. It's not necessarily to do with revenue production, as Janet, you were saying. It's to do with the expectation of the company being bigger next year through whatever measurement that you're using, and that the ability to scale really enables that, turbocharging that growth and capitalization, which, as Marion was just pointing out, is dependent upon the collection of free data. I think there's two things that follow up from that. One is that it is dependent. The turbocharging is dependent upon the continuous collect free data. You don't just collect data; you have to continuously collect data. It doesn't stop at any point, and so you are always continually needing to collect more and more data, and that's part of this growth. Part of the growth logic, but also the data logic, I guess. And I think that's the key weakness of these firms, and I think that's something that's really important politically. I guess the perspective is to think about, how can we intervene at that point of stopping that continuous and free collection. So if you want to take a kind of political stance, that's one of the key kind of areas we can intervene. That's kind of more of a comment. I think that Jenna and Marion, if you have anything to follow up on that'd be great to hear. The other was kind of following up from the previous questions, and so it's perhaps just about how much of this is a story about the US, and how much of it is a particular to the US. And so I have many disciplinary hats, and one of them is being a geographer, and so that's what I think about, and especially when we start talking about scale, and that's scale and so on, it always comes in. So how much is this a story about the US on the level of the coding elite, when it comes to the mediating subjectivity, algorithmic rationalities, and inequalities. And I know the paper you talk about some of the inequalities, how they are global, things like ghost work and such like that are very specifically global, but to what extent is the coding elite, say, very much a US story? And I was just then thinking, toying around with some, I guess, toying around with the notion of fractions of capital, and maybe the idea of different fractions of code or something like that as a kind of alternative. But yeah, thank you very much.
I mean, I think this is like a big question going forward. The US thing, we're thinking really consciously as we're writing this paper about how much we were just telling the story about the country we're in, or even just we're at Berkeley and the region that we're in. And I mean, I think it's important. I felt it was really important, and I'm really glad to have a geographer here, because I'm like, yes, some of this is a story of economic geography, right? And my boss at the iSchool, Annalise Aksenian, wrote this book called Regional Advantage, which was all about Silicon Valley and why it is where it is, right? And so we started the paper, I think, and I'm going to give credit to Marion because she did this, started it by placing the Society of Algorithms in a time and in a place, and talking about the origins of Silicon Valley, because I think that's so important. And it's not to make this a kind of a US centric story, but just to say this isn't it's not a global logic that kind of sits atop the world. It comes from somewhere, it comes from somewhere very particular. So we were trying to kind of look at, what was happening in the US, but also how the same kind of patterns were playing out in other parts of the world. So we talked a little bit about Europe, we talked about China, we talked about India, we talked about South Africa. We used some of the kind of common reference points, but we tried to position them in ways that weren't kind of the cliche, like the social credit system in China. Everyone's talking about it, often in ways I find really cliched and self-affirming and Eurocentric or US-centric. So we tried to kind of give a global sense of things. I still feel like there's a lot of research to be done in the rest of the world. And let me give you one really fascinating point that I have learned about since I took this job at Data and Society as the interim research director. So in our paper, we referenced the protest in the UK about this A-level, like for the A-level exams, there was this algorithm, because students couldn't sit their A-level exams, they were going to use this algorithm that basically predicted what they thought you would get as a score if you had sat the A-level exams. And of course, it took basically kind of the socioeconomic context you were in. So if you were an outperforming student in a school that didn't usually perform well, it assumed less of you. It just kind of reduced you to the mean of the environment you were in. And so you would be, no matter what you did on your trial test, it would kind of predict that you wouldn't have done as well if you had sat the exam. So all sorts of issues with taking a prediction and using that to determine something that's consequential to your life, which is where you go to college. That protest was it was successful. In the UK, they decided not to use that score. The UK, so I'm sure those of you, I went to school in the UK, there's this thing called the Commonwealth. And that same A-level system is used around the world. And that algorithm was used in the rest of the world and was not effectively protested and overturned. So for example, there's a researcher from Bangladesh who's participating in some of the workshops at Data and Society who was like, yeah, they use that algorithm in Bangladesh and that we didn't get to, reverse it. And whether that has to do with the media, like the mass media environment, and whether people affected had the ear of the right powerful people, I mean, that's all part of the equation as well. So I think some of those stories we're still trying to discover. And so I think it is a big area of research, is kind of looking at the global variability around some of these trends. But certainly I would say that the kind of incredible power of the coding elite being in a particular place in the US is consequential. The tentacles of the effects of what they're doing reach all around the world in ways that they scale, but they don't necessarily work, I guess is what I would say, to kind of bring back that theme. They are successfully deployed around the world with varying levels of effectiveness. Maybe they bring in lots of money from other parts of the world, but in terms of how those systems work for people in other parts of the world, much less effective, much less desirable, lots of negative consequences.
I mean, let me jump in real quick and say there is another way of bringing, these things together, right? So as much as we asked about it being the US story, it is, at least I don't see it as separate from a global phenomenon, in part because, and this is why that grounding in the beginning of the article is important, Silicon Valley, or the elite that you talk about, that power is derived from America's hegemony, right? And American imperialism. You can argue similarly that the big Chinese firms in part derive some of their power from the Chinese state as well. There are many ways you could make this argument, right? So I think that really what we're talking about here is techno-imperialism in its various forms. And big tech's power is not separate. You cannot remove that from the states, from within the geographical regions that they emerge from. It is what allows Silicon Valley to have a lot of sway in terms of funding of startups in Africa and different parts of the world. It is what fuels all of this, and the Commonwealth example is a great way of demonstrating this imperial aspect of it as well. So I think the locating it in the US is not to separate it from its global tentacles, right? It's to say that all of this is embedded on a global level in a way that requires, like you said, yes, evidence and studies from elsewhere, but it also requires thinking through the lens of empire and power in those ways. Marion, did you want to come in before I bring in Koray? His hands has been up for a while, and then Fabio.
Actually, Sarah, you said perfectly, probably much better than I would have some of the things that I wanted to say about sort of the fact that, so how do we think about this globality? So yes, we locate it in Silicon Valley because exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. But the globality it's not a US story. It is a global story. Right? It is a US story to the extent, yes, that it is in part a Silicon Valley story. But of course, these technologies and the services, reach globally, right? In a way that has never really happened before. And that poses all kinds of new problems that we need to think about. Now, there was a moment when we were very enthusiastic about all of this. You know, the moment, I guess, the rise of networks and, you know, all this stuff about like the Arab Spring and, you know, and then, of course, you know, you see the sort of downside of it, which is sort of the global connection between sort of conspiracy theorists and right-wing movements and all of that, right? So there's that too. But yeah, you know, I think, and I agree that, well, I agree. I mean, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I think that this is something that we don't mention very much in the paper, but this is an obvious critique of the paper, that, you know, that globality of you know, that whole industry is not very much mentioned. And you know, you also mentioned that, you know, it's not simply your story in the sense that you know, there's also another empire, right? China, which is reaching, you know, in a sort of similar way. You know, think about TikTok, think about, you know, and what is that? You know, what kind of globality is that? And how does it differ from, say, the globality of Facebook, for instance? And we can see, you know, sort of a geopolitics being played out, of course, on all of this. So yes, it is embedded in a place, but that place is, you know, in different places, but those places are themselves, you know, global powers that are vying for, you know, control.
Correct.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jenna and Marion. This is very good. I loved it. Learned a lot from it, and it made me think a number of things. And I wanted to ask you what you think about it. Speaking of China, they just passed a resolution splitting Alibaba's exchange platform with that of payments, Alipay's, and now Alibaba is not allowed to pay, whereas Apple Pay can do it, Google can use it, and it seems like China is following Hayek's logic of separating markets and introducing competitiveness better than what we do in America. But my question is not about geographical distinctions, but about how to understand the old processes that you very nicely and macro-sociologically summarize for us. One possibility is that perhaps bringing economic sociology in to this description of algorithms, datas, and programs, and what they do to actors and representations and devices might be a fantastic idea. We didn't see, for instance, new analysis of markets, cryptocurrencies, blockchains, platforms, platform economic foundations, and those granular studies about them. It might actually help you a lot to formulate something you very nicely show, which is, you're basically saying that to economists, actually, it's not only network effects. We can't just say that, oh, when you have a market platform, an exchange platform, network effects are up for grabs. But you frame it as free interaction, but it's actually a form of economization that's studied a lot in sociology and anthropology. It's barter economization. So Facebook invites you to barter economize a certain relationship, and then says that, look, whatever happens from that relationship is mine. I'm going to use it for my own interest. Perhaps it's then possible to say, to argue that, wait a minute, this is not yours. This is something social. You are grabbing it. It's not like when I pay wage, your labor is mine, as Marx said. So you're saying something very similar and showing us that there is a material representational order that produces a certain economization relationship in a specific way, and it has political and class consequences. So I would ask you, how would things change, for instance, if you treated data, code, and program separately and analytically? Sorry, data, algorithm, and program. Did I say, am I saying the same thing? Yes. Data, algorithm, and program separately. And in terms of specific actors that produce them intentionally and unintentionally, and how our togetherness, whatever we call it, society, our communities, have a claim on that. I think this might also give you a perfect chance to say something to regulators that completely misunderstand platforms and try to regulate things that they don't understand or choose not to understand, which is right now we're facing world history's largest unregulated markets, like digital advertisement markets or crypto exchange markets. Crypto exchange markets in decentralized and centralized forms are now the 5th largest economy in the world after United Kingdom. It's around $3 trillion, which is unheard of. We never had such a thing. So I wonder what we would see if you push your analytical categories a little bit to include economic sociology and anthropology and new studies of platforms, also analytically separating data, algorithm, and program. Thank you.
I have to point to Marion because she's an economic sociologist, and she wrote a piece on the gift economy citing Mouse. So Marion, I totally think this is a question for you.
Yeah, so, the best defense for this paper is that, this is a paper that is really focused on the social structure. And yes, it doesn't go very much into markets, but this is definitely part of our research agenda. And I've written, as Jenna said, I've written about this. Actually, the way that I understand this is indeed, there is this barterization. We call it in the paper that I was talking about, the motion bargain, sort of this idea that you have a sort of gift exchange, but it's not quite a gift because the commercial element is lurking right there, right from the get-go. But it is not, at the same time, it is not very assertive. And so it is hidden a little bit, like in the gift, there's this sort of obfuscation that you have of this obligation to repay. And what we are arguing is that at the end of the day, our relationship with these platforms has produced all of this data about ourselves. Right now, it's not like the data existed before, the data is itself something that came out of the relationship, of the socio-technical relationship with the platform, right? So it's very hard to say. When I hear a lot of, there's often a language of sort of dispossession and, you've heard, maybe colonization. There's been various terms to talk about this. Shoshana Zuboff talks about, this moment of expropriation, but it's not like this stuff, like we owned this stuff before in the sense of, yes, it was who we were, but it didn't exist that way. So there is this, there is a creation of something that is separate from us and that is different from us as a result of that relationship, but precisely because it is structured as this sort of gift relationship, like gift in the sense of, quasi-gift, in the sense of this, you're being essentially embedded in sort of this network of reciprocity where you have to constantly, feed the machine. Because of that, at the end of the day, and we wake up and we realize all the stuff that we've produced over the years for Facebook or for Google or for whatnot, and then we suddenly feel cheated, right? And so we have these demands for monetization and marketization and so on, right? So now, so that we can, again, assert ownership on this stuff. And this is, so that's, if you want, that's really the sequence that we have seen in this digital capitalism. But at the end of the day, we are likely to end up with a real commodification and a real market where we will actually sell our data. And we will feel good about it because it will be better than the relationship we had before, which was actually an exploitation that was based on this sort of, social reciprocity, implicit social reciprocity that was just as exploitative, if not worse. And so that's sort of if you want to think about economization, it's not like the economization is like immediate and obvious. It's something that is progressing. And I mean, we are not there yet. We're not at the market, we don't have a market yet for where individuals sell their data. I mean, base a few experiments, but it's not really, but it's possible that we will end up there. And then, we will see it as, this is completely natural, but it was never natural. And it was only made natural because we had this sort of moment, of dispossession, yes, through that sort of exploitation built into, the gift relationship, the accumulation, what we call accumulation by gift. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but okay, great. So that's, this is one of the things that we can say, that's one way of talking about economization there. And you're right. I mean, there's so much more to be said. And, I'm just beginning, looking at blockchain and NFTs and all that. And, it's yet another whole area, but that may actually become the vehicle through which, the monetization, the commodification of personal data actually takes place. And we see that already a little bit around NFTs. So it's sort of this, if you will, it's this economization, but it's not it's layer by layer. And each layer adds something sort of new, right? One is you constitute, a data that is, again, separate from the person, and then it becomes an asset, and then it becomes, something that you can sell, and then, and then you can actually, the person can claim ownership rights on it, and so on and so forth. So you have all of these processes that are happening in sequence, and it's important, I think, to tell that sequence.
Thank you, Marion. In the interest of time, I will have Fabio give his question, and then Janet, because you've already asked a couple questions, I will read Spence's just so that we have, or maybe Marion and Jenna, you can copy Spence's question so you have it to make sure that it's there. And then Vicky's hand also went up after Janet. So let's say Fabio, you go, and then if Jenna and Marion can address Spence's question as part of that, and then based on how much time we have left, we can attend to Jenna and Vicky's question. Okay.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. This was a fantastic discussion over a fantastic paper, and I'm really excited about the focus on inequality in class and the various terrains of enclosure to the comments you just described, Marion, in your answers. This is really fantastic work that I think recenter some of the debates on really important issues. Following up on some of the comments that have been made before, including, on the question of the state and barter, if you're seeing some of these technologies as an expression of class relations of some kind or another, could we then see also the sort of the transformation of everyday relationships as also an expansion of specific class relations, rather than as something completely new, right? Where in fact what we're seeing is a permeation of certain forms of inequality and an acceptance of them in everyday life, rather than simply a transformation through algorithms as such. That's all I had.
Yeah, I sort of in that question, I'm sensing a tension in our paper, which is to argue for something new and transformative while also very much arguing that this is the latest kind of iteration of an old dynamic. And I don't know if we can have it both ways or if we've tried to do too much. Yeah, I mean, we haven't really in this conversation talked much about inequality, which is interesting. And I think there's a second section of the paper that really grapples with the history of using quantification and statistical techniques to try and distribute fairly, and kind of the vision of, I mean, okay, going back to Weber and bureaucracy, that was about kind of using rules and using some instruments, something outside of the person kind of making the decision to guide it and make it impersonal and standardize it. And then we looked at some of the kind of actuarial techniques. I mean, there's a lot of conversation now about risk recidivism tools, and those are not new. Those are not new. I mean, maybe if they're using machine learning, they're doing it in new ways. I think actually a lot of the tools that are used for things like risk scoring are not very sophisticated. They're not using machine learning. So it's an old system. And it seems like maybe we're caught in this endless cycle where we kind of go from like, this is what's going to make things fair, to realizing how unfair those systems are. For lots of reasons, not just because the data reflects the unfairness of society, and it just propagates through those models like a reiteration, a reinforcement of that inequality. But because there are other dimensions of these models that do it as well, they do it by making the whole thing so opaque that it's hard to challenge, and it's hard to even see the inequalities now because they're kind of hidden behind machine logic that isn't human, right? It's like, this is what we predict about someone, and you don't know exactly why it's predicted that. So I guess what I'm saying, kind of come back to your question, is I think this is that we're a little stuck. I don't know if Marion has an idea about the way out, but I think at the end of the day, we've definitely made an argument that this is kind of propagating some old patterns. And trying to separate out what's kind of the newest version of like distributing resources unequally in society with what seems to be truly novel here is tricky, very tricky.
Well, I think, I think it's in some way it's quite simple. You have the old inequalities of income, education, race, class, gender, all of these, you might find them being sort of reproduced through these technologies, right? So, there's an enormous literature, for instance, as you know, on racial inequalities, and particularly the disparate impact of algorithms on, minorities, racial minorities. But there is also a point that we're making in the paper, that these technologies create new kinds of groups, or new kinds of divisions, if you will, in society. So, you can think about sort of the way that, and this is work by John Cheney-Leopold, Louisa Moore has also written about this, the way, for instance, that sort of machines identify patterns of risk, at the border, or, the way that they decide who should be treated as a citizen and who should not be, right? And it's not exactly, it overlaps in part with sort of the old inequality. So you're very likely to find, for instance, race being featuring in important ways in sort of scales of dangerousness according to this algorithm, for instance. But it's not completely that. It's also something new. And so if you think about another example would be credit scoring, right? So the credit score creates a scale of credit risk. And yes, the poor are more likely to have a bad credit score, the rich are more likely to have a good one, and so on, and the educated. But it's not simply that. it's reprocessing, and it's creating these sort of new groups, those who are below, say, 520, and those who are between 600 and 700, and so on and so forth. You are creating sort of new ways of thinking about social stratification. And so there are new inequalities that come out of that, because not only, say, your opportunities will change depending on when you are on that scale, like, so for instance, what kind of credit you can obtain. But it's also that, if the credit score percolates then into, your ability to get housing or to get insurance or to get employment, then these effects, are turbocharged, and they have a very big impact on your life chances. So it's both, of course, the old inequalities are still very much there, but there's a sort of, there's a sort of new axis, if you will, of stratification that is happening, and it's, that is emerging. Actually, I shouldn't say one new, it's many new axes of stratification that are emerging, around credit, around maybe, fitness, maybe, around insurance or whatnot, various scales of risk. And that's something that is native to this capitalism, I think.
I would add, but the effect is that it entrenches the inequalities that were already existing. They may be new ways, but they deepen the existing ones, right? Because of the feedback loop, right? It is, if you had a low credit score and it impacts your ability to get a mortgage, it's the same people who inevitably bear the brunt of this, right? The harms are exacerbated for specific groups.
Exacerbated, I'm not sure. So this is an empirical question. Remember that before credit scores, what you had was redlining, and you had, all kinds of horrible ways of, discriminating. The credit score sort of changes this because it is sort of based in, essentially rooted in patterns of behavior, but doesn't, take into account the fact that patterns of behavior are very much structurally defined and shaped, partly, on the demand side, and partly also on the supply side, the way that people are being advertised, different kinds of products, and so on and so forth. There's lots of ways in which, these inequalities become perpetrated through these instruments. So it's in part the old inequalities, you're right. But at the same time, you're creating, for instance, a new difference between those who get the subprime and those who get the regular mortgages. And that is, that is a fundamental axis that's going to, lead them into two very different kinds of, credit trajectories, right?
So to add one thing to that, I think, just as like maybe a simplification of it, I think there's a kind of a more fine-grained way in which those distinctions are made, which allow people who belong to certain disprivileged groups to kind of escape them in a sense. And maybe they qualify for things that old crude systems of group membership would have excluded them from. But I think it staves off a more fundamental reckoning with those inequalities, because now it no longer looks like racial discrimination, for example, because it's not based on crude group categories, but the more fine-grained groups still fall down along these stratification lines. So yeah. It's a slight change, but a reproduction of the broader trend.
Yes. So it is a reproduction, and of these sort of old inequalities, but in a different way. So that's why actually the legal instruments move from sort of, discriminatory intent, which was sort of the obvious way in which the old systems was working, to, disparate impact and things like that, right? So you have sort of a changing legal standard, but you can also, think about the ways in which, there are, there's sort of, people could potentially have a different kind of politics, and it could be the politics around the categories itself, the categories that they are being slotted into now, which are sort of these new categories around sort of, the credit score, for instance.
But Marion, like, to that point, all of this, but at least in the account you've given, which is extremely important, depends on, as you say, right, the ownership of the means of production, like in your account. And if we're saying that the approach is to assume that algorithms are the means of production, the question of ownership, like property rights, needs to be made really explicit, right? And that right now, like if you look at Caterina Pistor, we had a conversation with her a while ago, like that's being debated by legal scholars. So it seems to me like this is a little more lacking in like clarity than we think. So, and that's why I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I think I'm going to cycle back to a lot of things that like Kian said and Seyram said, and is just like in the world of like, well, what Martha Poon calls the computation industry, like big tech, but also startups, right? Accumulation is not just based on consumption of digital products, right? And computational power. It's also financialization, right? So like if that is as important as like old-fashioned surplus value derived from labor, right? I guess the question I've been trying to poke at a little bit is like, can we assume that we know that the ownership of the means of production in terms of property rights is as clear-cut as we seem to be saying? And can we assume kind of a labor theory of value, right? And so like, I think I'm going to link this to what I think Seyram was pushing at. Like, so I'm looking at fintech in Africa right now. If I use these categories, right? Ownership of means of production, I assume that's algorithms or data, et cetera, I can see and understand certain things, but the point of accumulation is like not only labor power. If you look at like Flutterwave, right? That's a payments firm based in both Lagos and San Francisco, to Seyram's point, right? They recently had a $170 million investment that includes 2 private equity firms, right? So the total, I think, valuation, so the investment, I think, totaled $225 million, if I'm getting this right. Their valuation, market capital valuation, then passed the $1 billion mark. So they became a unicorn. So you can like just thinking about like the ratios of like a $220 million investment gets them a market capitalization past the $1 billion mark. How and why? Right? If you look, as Kian has done, at the financial reporting and their public statements, what they insist on is not their revenues. They insist on the fact that they processed $5.4 billion of transactions from 2016 to 2019. That's not revenue. That's just transactions processed, from which, of course, they make fees, right? But like their revenue only stands at like $30 million. I mean, that's a lot of money, but still. So, and there are other examples, InterSwitch, which is also a Nigerian payments, same story, but Visa, invested. So the goal for them is market capitalization. It's an IPO, it's a public offering, right? And here, for me at least, the owners of capital, it's just not clear to me. It's not just I own algorithms, I'm selling digital products to people, they're consuming them, and then class follows. Like or at least I can't get my head around that. And it seems to me from the conversations that I've had with this group over the last 4 years has been like where value lies is really in the APIs and leveraging the APIs. And it's not just like monetizing the data, and it's not necessarily the forms of labor that we recognize. I mean, you've done a great job of like in your review of elaborating the different forms of labor, but anyway, I guess I know that was a lot that I just dumped, but I guess I find it all to be in my own research much more difficult than than some of the assumptions about where value lies and the usefulness of the labor theory of value. So I'll stop there. Maybe Vicky, you want to jump in? That's not really something you can
I've got to jump off too, but I think it's a different take on the question about how useful the labor theory of value is. So it's rethinking, I found a lot of the work on rethinking the history of capitalism around the sea and questions of trade, particularly, they've really turned my head around about a lot of assumptions that I have had about the sort of satanic mills and production and the sort of labor theory of value as a central driver of industrialization. And so I was just wondering whether, in fact, that work around the C might be useful for opening up new theoretical categories. And it's really about sort of network, different conception of productivity and value. So I think particularly this Farhad Bashara, who's at UVA, I think he's really got some wonderful work he's done, and Johan Matthew as well. But Bashara is the one who I think is really amazing guy. He's an assistant professor at UVA, I think. He has a book called Sea of Debt, but I think the essay, he has an essay that's more recent than the Sea of Debt that I think is really sort of the beginning of this. Anyway, it's turned all of the sort of the British Manchester satanic mills that kind of just really pushed aside.
I'm wondering,
sorry,
thinking about the C. So I would love to talk more about that. I noticed Spencer's question further up, he's gone now, but about digital capitalism and its global reach and how has that been achieved. And the first thing that came to mind is the global network of sub-oceanic cables, fiber optic cables. And like that being like how you don't have digital capitalism with this kind of global reach without a global network infrastructure, and those cables are a really important part of it. I don't know if that, I mean, that's an infrastructure. So the funders, the financiers for that, and the, you know, whoever owns and kind of operates the equipment to lay the cables and to build out that infrastructure and to profit off of it. I don't know if that, that's a C, it's related to the sea because those are ships that are laying those cables. I don't know if that's recent. That's not like the long history of the sea. I don't know if that comes into your work at all.
For me, the long history is it links to Janet's question about how one thinks about value, both value then in the past, in our accounts of capitalism, and whether if you rethink them then, whether what that does to the present. I'm afraid I have got like dinner guests who are sitting at a table. So I have to go to them.
Yeah, we are beyond our time. So if folks want to hop off, of course, they're welcome to.
Great. It was wonderful.
But Janet, if you want to, you know, you're the host. So Marion and Jenna, your time, of course, we value everybody's time here. So let's just remember that we said we would end at 7:30 Eastern. So it is 3 minutes beyond that. Let's acknowledge that. You know, the host and Marion and Jenna can decide if you want to keep the conversation going beyond that. But thank you so much for your time. It's really been interesting and yeah, I mean, I will stay on if folks are staying on, but you know, just acknowledge that there's a reason why people are disappearing.
Yeah, it's 4:30 on the West Coast. It's early. I don't know if Marion might have a response to Janet's question. I don't know.
It is such an important and big question. You know, the paper is really more focused on, you know, I think the paper is speaking more to the literature on social stratification than the literature on markets and economic sociology and valuation. I think that's pretty